guys, it's Emily, and today I'm here to bring you another Recent Reads video. It's November 1st, but I wanted to get my October reading all wrapped up before I started talking about non-fiction November stuff. So I'm here to talk about the final 3 books I finished in October. October was kind of a weird reading month for me. I finished my 7 books that I had said I was going to read, but I finished 2 of them within like the first 3 days of the month. Then there was a 10-day gap where I didn't finish anything. Then I finished another one. Then there was another 6-day gap where I didn't finish anything. And then I finished 4 books in the last week of October. So it was just a really weird reading month for me. But anyway, let me talk about the last 3 books that I read. The first book that I wanted to mention was Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. This was my victober read for the month, and it was also a read for me. However, the first time I read this was way back when I was like 13, and I didn't really understand it that well. And anyway, I'm not even sure I finished the whole thing now that I've read it again. But anyway, I'm counting it as a reread because I definitely read some part of it back then. But anyway, so I listened to this predominantly on audiobook, and this was fine. It's about 2 families, the Earnshaws of Wuthering Heights and the Lintons of Thrushcross Grange. And these are 2 estates that are way out in the middle of nowhere in the moors of England. And it's about how these 2 families become interconnected and how they basically are destroyed due to the revenge of the Earnshaws' adopted foundling Heathcliff. Heathcliff was picked up on the side of the road by Mr. Earnshaw at the beginning of the book, and the 2 Earnshaw children, Catherine and Henry, have 2 very different reactions. Catherine falls in love with them, and Henry hates them and treats them very poorly. And because of Henry's hatred for Heathcliff, Heathcliff decides to get revenge on Henry and ultimately revenge on the entire Earnshaw family. Catherine ends up marrying Edgar Linton, and then Heathcliff expands his revenge plot to include the Lintons as well. He ends up marrying Edgar Linton's sister Isabella, and then basically destroying her, and then eventually he takes over the 2nd generation of Lintons and Earnshaws, Catherine, and Edgar's child, Kathy, and then his own son. What's his son's name? And his son's name is Linton as well. Sorry, I went totally blank there for a second. And then also Henry's son, Harrington. So these 3 children are basically under his, well, they're not children, but like young adults are under his thumb, and he's basically a terrible person. And yeah, I didn't have any sympathy for Heathcliff once it got to the 2nd generation part. Like the 1st generation, okay, you sort of get because Henry was a douchebag to him, and then yeah, Catherine broke his heart by marrying Edgar. But it's just like, once the kids are involved, like the kids didn't do anything, so it's not their fault. And so I just really did not enjoy the latter part of this book. But yeah, this was okay. I probably will never read this again. I'm glad I read it though, just to make so now I know for sure that I know the story. But yeah, I also watched the 1939 edition of Wuthering Heights with Laurence Olivier, and they greatly simplify the story by taking out the 2nd generation entirely, which makes Heathcliff more, sympathetic in a way. And then they also show more of the Catherine-Heathcliff relationship, so you get to, relate more to why they're in love with each other. I just finished The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yōko Ogawa. I read this for the Around the Year challenge. One of the prompts was read a book that relates to the 2020 Olympics in Japan, and one way you could do that was by reading a book written by a Japanese author or a book that is set in Japan, and this book meets both of those qualifications. This is about a woman that is hired to be the housekeeper for a former math professor who is a genius, but who was in a very bad accident and like 20 years before the book starts, and he lost his memory. He only retains things for 80 minutes at a time, and once it goes past 80 minutes, he remembers nothing. He also, of course, remembers the past, pre the accident. So he's been a bit of a hassle for the housekeeping agency because people keep quitting because they're so frustrated with them. So this housekeeper thinks she's going to be just like that, but she ends up developing a relationship with the professor along with her son, who the professor calls Root. And so it's about how these three individuals become a family. It's very much focused on math. The professor is always explaining complicated math things to the housekeeper and to her son. It's also very much about baseball, which I don't think anybody else has really mentioned. I didn't really remember that, but they bond over baseball. The professor is very obsessed with this one player who, of course, retired a long time ago, but he doesn't know that, and so Root and his mother are sort of, prolonging the illusion for the professor. They go to a baseball game, they start to get to know each other emotionally, and it's just a very interesting and unique story about the power of family, choosing your own family, the power of math and how math is sort of the underpinning of like a lot of our life, and a lot of the things we do. It's also about like the importance of memory, and does memory make you who you are, and is memory the foundation of relationships, because of course he doesn't ever really remember meeting them. He's constantly re-meeting them, and yet they do grow and start to have this bond. So yeah, this was a really wonderful book. I definitely recommend it. I will say the math stuff, a lot of it went over my head, so those parts I sort of skimmed, and I probably didn't get everything out of it that I should have, but overall, I really enjoyed this, and I definitely recommend it. The third book that I want to mention, I finished last night at about 9 o'clock. I was really wanting to finish it, and that was Sabrina and Corina, Stories by Fajardo-Anstine, and this is probably, definitely my favorite book of these three, and possibly my favorite book of the month, although Giver of Stars was really good too. This is a collection of stories, short stories, that are all centered around Denver and the women, different Hispanic women, or actually Latina women, I should say, that lived there, and it's about their personal lives, and it's also about the, issues surrounding gentrification. They talk about how most of the women that are in the story live in the North Side neighborhood, which white people now call Highlands neighborhood, and there's also discussion of how a lot of the Hispanic and Latinx people that live, in like downtown Denver are being forced out because of the high property taxes and that sort of thing. There's also discussion of domestic abuse. There's discussion of family, of course. There's discussion of how do you achieve your dreams when you don't have the financial power to do so. It's also about relationships and how relationships with men can be very dangerous for these women. Particularly, there's a story about a woman who is blinded by her boyfriend, which is particularly powerful. There's stories about death and about what happens to you, the family, when you die and how it affects them. And it's just a really, really great book. But I would say predominantly the main theme is family, figuring out what your family means to you, how your family supports you during times of trouble. And it's also very much about the gentrification of Denver and making sure that these, people retain their traditions and retain their values in the face of increasing cost of living and increasing, feeling of being pushed aside and pushed out of their homeland. And then also, the very last story in here is about a woman that is going to community college, and she has a white professor for history of the American West. And not only is this professor white, she's from the East Coast, and so she doesn't really have any first-hand knowledge of the history of the area, and so she is telling people things that are wrong, and the student is trying to correct her and getting in trouble for doing so. So it's very much about how white people tend to whitewash things that bother them and things that don't seem important to them. But yeah, this is a fabulous book. Definitely recommend it. Yeah, it's just a really, really wonderful book. Currently, I'm not reading anything except my C.S. Lewis Book of Letters, but I'm going to start Becoming Today by Michelle Obama. I'm looking forward to that. I'm going to listen to the audio when I drive over to my parents' house for lunch. I hope everybody else had a great reading month in October and that you got some great books lined up for Nonfiction November. And I'll talk to you again soon. Bye!